Good evening. My name is Yoram Bitton, and I'm the Chief of the African and Middle East Division. On behalf of the division, I want to welcome you to the Library of Congress and to this special event celebrating the completion of the digitization of the Hebrew manuscripts. In Jewish tradition, moments of joy are often intertwined with remembrance. As we gather today in celebration, we also pause to honor the memory of those who perished in the tragic attacks on September 11, keeping their lives and legacies alive within us. The Library of Congress holds a remarkable collection of Hebrew manuscripts, more than 270 of which are now freely available online through a digitization project generously sponsored by the Berg Foundation. These high-resolution digital images can be accessed from any computer or mobile device, opening these treasures to scholars and to the general public alike. The manuscripts written in Hebrew and related languages span from the 10th to the 20th centuries and encompass religious texts, poetry, legal writings, and works on Jewish magics and folk medicine. Highlights include the Washington Agadah that we have a facsimile on display, illuminated by Yoel Ben Shimon and currently on view in the Treasure Gallery, a 14th century collection of responsa by great legal authority Shlomo ben Aderet Rashba, and one of the oldest surviving sheets of Torah scroll dating back to the 10th century. Much of this collection was acquired in the 1910s from the collection of Ephraim Dinard, through the library has continued to build upon it in the years since. I would like to extend our sincere thanks to the Berg Foundation for supporting both the digitization of these Hebrew manuscripts and tonight's program. We are privileged tonight to feature one of the foremost scholars of Jewish art, Sharon Mintz. Sharon is the Curator of Jewish Art at the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary and a leading specialist in illuminated Hebrew manuscripts and rare printed books. Since 1995, she has also served as a senior consultant for Judaica at Sotheby's, where she has cataloged and appraised Hebrew books for Judaica sales worldwide. Sharon has created many important exhibitions and written and edited many catalogs, books, and articles. We are truly honored to have her with us this evening to speak about the Hebrew manuscript collection at the Library of Congress. And now, it is my great pleasure to welcome Sharon Mintz, who will present her lecture from Scroll to Screen, celebrating the digitization of Hebrew manuscript.
Thank you, Yoram. It's such a pleasure to be here. I was trying to think about when I was last at the Library of Congress. Definitely too long ago. Such a magnificent place, such wonderful collections, and it's really wonderful to be here to be celebrating the conclusion of the Hebrew Manuscript Digitization Project, which I'm very grateful to the Berg Foundation for making possible. And having 270 of these manuscripts online is a remarkable achievement. It's really a game changer, making things accessible to the public, worldwide, scholars, researchers, lay people around the world. On a personal note, I think that the digitization of manuscripts has been the single most important feature in changing the landscape of Jewish scholarship, because it really makes things available in a way that weren't beforehand, and you can study things which you wouldn't necessarily have had access to. There are enough treasures at the Library of Congress to fill a year's worth of lectures, but as an art historian, I wanted to focus my lecture tonight on some of the most important decorated Hebrew manuscripts in the collection of the Library of Congress. And I guess if you had to pick one to start with, and some of you may have heard a little bit about this before, maybe a lot about this before, because there have been 2 facsimiles published, I'm going to look at the Washington Haggadah. If anybody can't see the stage and wants to move a little bit closer, please, be my guest. If that's okay. But if you're happy where you are, that's good. The Washington Haggadah was created in 1478 by the scribe and artist Joel ben Simeon. Joel ben Simeon is sometimes known as Feibush Ashkenazi, and he was one of the most important Jewish scribes and illuminators of the 15th century. One might say the most important. He was born around 1420 in Cologne, and he spent much of his career moving back and forth between the Jewish communities of Germany and Italy. And his mobility was not that unusual because the 15th century was a time of instability for the Jews of Central Europe. There were expulsions from Cologne, and there were expulsions from Mainz, there were expulsions from other German cities, and these upheavals shaped Joel's life and career. He worked in many different places, including Ulm, Germany, Cremona, Florence, and other cities in Italy that we can't exactly identify what city, but we know that he was working in Italy for much of his career. And he absorbed the visual languages of both German Gothic and Italian Renaissance, and this combination of styles is one of the defining features of his work. And he was not only a scribe, but he was also an artist, and he frequently signed and dated his work. And it's through these details that we encounter a historical figure who is not just a craftsman and a scribe, but also an artist with a clear sense of self. And just to give you a sense, after several hundred years, we now have more than 30 manuscripts that are attributed to his hand. 12 of them are signed by him, and another 21 of them are unsigned, but through scholarly research are attributed to him. These include Bibles, prayer books, and most especially Haggadot, the Passover text, and no less than 8 Haggadot are ascribed to his hand, so it's 25% of his extant output. He seems to have been particularly drawn to the Haggadah because it offered space for storytelling, for illustration, with a touch of humor. And Joel ben Simeon took this opportunity to integrate word and image, and he used lively decorations to draw the readers of his books into the experience of the Exodus story. So the Washington Haggadah, as I mentioned, was completed in 1478, and it is one of his best-known works, and we're going to look at a few pages from that, and there's a facsimile that's on display right now outside. It's among the finest Hebrew illuminated manuscripts of its time, and its survival here at the Library of Congress allows us to study a really wonderful and beautiful example of Jewish art and also the personality of its maker. So at first glance, and you're seeing the opening page on the right and a page shortly thereafterwards on the left, the manuscript impresses with its elegant calligraphy, but the heart of Joel ben Simeon's artistry lies in the illustrations. He decorated the pages with narrative scenes that bring the text to life. So this Haggadah is designed not just to be read aloud at the Seder, but also to explain and dramatizing the Exodus story, and he provides visual cues. So as you look at the slide on the right, let's see if this works. Oh, yes, it does. Excellent. Okay. You can see 2 scenes at the bottom. The book opens with instructions for searching for the leaven. It's instructions for what you do before Passover begins. This is the standard opening of the Haggadah, Orla Arbasar, on the eve of the 14th day. What do? You need to search for the leaven, and Joel ben Simeon helpfully tells us that you don't actually have to look in the places where no leaven is found, no chametz is found, but in fact, he's got an illustration of a man with a candle looking in a cupboard, searching very diligently, and a man down here burning the leftover levin, the chametz, before Passover with a bellows in hand, making sure that every last crumb is gone. Over here, we have the opening page of the text of the Seder, Ha-lachma anya. This is the bread of our affliction. And you can see for an opening prayer of Ha-lachma anya, the bread of affliction, it's actually illuminated in gold. This is gold leaf. So it's very lavish treatment. This is gold leaf as well that he's applied to the parchment. And then you have these wonderful birds down here, which don't appear to have anything to do with the illustration, with the text particularly, but are just there to enliven the page. One of the most engaging sections of the Haggadah is the four sons. Oh, thank you. The wise son, the wicked son, the simple son, and the one who does not know how to ask. And this is a pedagogical passage which emphasizes that the story of the Exodus has to be told differently depending on the person who's hearing it, the child who's hearing it, or who's in the room, actually. So Job Ben Simeon illustrates this with these wonderful, whimsical figures, and you see the Chacham, the wise son over here. He's deeply engaged in his book. He looks like a sober scholar. He's studying a book, and he seems quite steeped in tradition. This is the Rasha, the wicked son. The traditional way of depicting a wicked son, if that's not going to work, you can come over here so you can see it. And there's plenty of seats on this side. And, you know, maybe it will work and maybe it won't, but there's lots of seats on that side. And we'll just take it from there. But that's fine. Like, everybody will see here and they'll see it. So we have the wicked son over here. And traditionally, the wicked son is shown as a knight. Jews obviously were not knights. They were often forbidden to even hold arms of any sort. So if you wanted to depict something that was really wicked, it would be the people who were coming after you. And you think about the Knights Crusaders and all of the crusade pogroms that happened in Europe. You know, beginning with the First Crusade onwards, the knights were wicked. After that, we have a simple son up here. And the simple son, it's interesting. You don't usually see him holding a book. Usually his hands are folded. Here he's dressed in a cloak. It's a very warm, worn cloak. And he looks a bit bemused by the book that he's holding. And then on bottom of this page is the jester. And this is the son who doesn't know how to ask, or the child, I should say. It's Arba Banim, but you know, we don't genderize it nowadays. It's the child who doesn't know how to ask. And the jester was a fool. It was someone who spouted nonsense, and that's the way that often the fourth son was depicted in the text. Okay. One of the most interesting images in this Haggadah is the image that relates to the text which begins, Shvoch Hamasra al Hagayim, pour out your wrath upon the nations who do not know you. It's basically asking for retribution for all the people who have harmed the Jews over the centuries. And here, Joel Ben Simeon has left a very large margin to illustrate this prayer. What's going on? At this point in the Seder, on Passover evening, a cup of wine is poured for Elijah the prophet, and children are often sent to the door to open the door to welcome Elijah in. So this is a moment heralding hope for redemption, right? This is a moment Elijah is heralding the Messiah, and it's a very interesting illustration. You see here a man on a donkey. It's not clear if the man on the donkey is actually the Messiah or whether that's Elijah heralding. He's not labeled. And I'm wondering if that screen could be made a little bit brighter. I don't know who's here. Is it as dark as it looks? It looks a little dark to me. Okay. And are you hearing me well, or should I be speaking in more? Okay, that's good. And the entire family is hanging on, is riding on the back of this donkey, and they're riding their way to redemption. Like you're looking at this page, and you're thinking, you know, let us hope that this year we're going to see a year of peace and redemption for everybody around the world. But and there's some discussion about whether this is not the maidservant of the household hanging on to the tail. That's what Katrin thinks. This book has been very well studied. There are 2 facsimile editions of this book, but Betzalel Narkis, Katrin Cogman-Appel, David Stern. If you want to know more, there's certainly what to look at. I actually have one of the facsimiles, and I bring it out to the Passover table. It's a lot of fun to see how it goes. And I wanted just to give you an example of the way in which scribes would end their book. There's usually a passage at the end of a manuscript called a colophon. Manuscripts didn't have title pages. Title pages are an invention of the printed book. The first Hebrew title page dates to 1507 in a book printed in Fano, Italy. What you had at the end of manuscripts was a short paragraph where the scribe stated his name, and if you're lucky, he said where and when he wrote the book and who he was writing it for. And sometimes you get one of those things, and sometimes you get all 4 of those things. And here, I have a blow-up of the colophon, and Joel ben Simeon says, "The work was completed, and it is sufficient." Video means either it's sufficient or the ink was completed. Either way, the book's over. And today is the 25th day of the month of Shvat in the year 238, right? 238, according to the short enumeration, equals 1478 in our counting. The word of the least of scribes, Joel, the son of Simeon, of blessed memory. So while the colophon in the Washington Haggadah does not actually mention painting, it's very clear to all scholars that this is the work of his hand. It's recognizable from his style that we see in other manuscripts which are signed. It's consistent with his work, and the book is attributed to him. Joel ben Simeon, his lively images have created a visual language that borrow freely from the cultures around him, but he remains deeply tied to the Jewish tradition, and he stands out as one of the only medieval Jewish scribes whose life and personality we can trace with some clarity. And through his signed works and his brilliant illustrations, he left really a vivid record of a working Jewish artist in the 15th century in Europe. And you could actually probably give a series of 5 lectures just on Joel ben Simeon, but I'm going to jump ahead to a few other genres of manuscripts here. I mentioned that I'm going to be looking at decorated manuscripts, but because the library holds such an important and rare early undecorated scroll of Esther, I will start with that. Purim is a joyful holiday that celebrates Queen Esther's salvation of the Jewish people of the Persian Empire from Haman's plot to destroy them around the 5th century of the Common Era. And as a result of this salvation, the Jews around the world celebrate the holiday of Purim, and on this holiday, the book of Esther is read in scroll format in the synagogue. And individuals sometimes bring their own scrolls to read along, or they could read it at home, but there's something to be said. People often go to the synagogue to hear it read publicly. And this scroll that you're looking at here is actually one of the very, very few surviving scrolls from the medieval period. There are less than 10 of them. It's an Ashkenazi script. It's kind of a German Gothic script. Oh, look, you put it over there. I can look it right there. Thank you, Jan. It's a German script. And you're looking at 2 of the panels, 2 of the membranes from this Esther scroll. And as I mentioned, it's not decorated, but it is a very interesting and important work, and it's wonderful that it is digitized and available for scholars to study. We'll talk about why digitization is important for scrolls in a minute, but just by way of background. Although we have Hebrew illuminated and decorated manuscripts from the early medieval period, beginning with the Leningrad codices from the Cairo Geniza, and in Europe from the 13th century onwards, for some reason, we don't have decorated Esther scrolls until much later. The earliest one that we have is from 1564. It was written by a woman. We don't know who did the art. Her name was Estelina. And it's in a private collection, but you can look it up online. It belongs to Mr. Berginsky. And if you put Esther Scroll and Estelina online, you will find it. And he has also digitized a lot of his work, so you can actually look at it online and see through the whole thing. But so we begin with decorated Esther Scrolls in 1564. No, that's the wrong one, sorry. Pushing the wrong thing here. But it doesn't really hit its full flourishing until the 17th and the 18th century. And that's where you begin to have these wonderful, profusely illustrated Esther scrolls, and particularly in Italy. And that's exactly what we're looking at here. And the curators at the Library of Congress, along with the conservation staff, thank you very much, have brought this scroll out. And you can see it in the room right adjacent to this. And what you're looking at here is a scroll of Esther, where you see the text is in, let's see, I'm gonna move that up here, move that over here. It's in double panels. Why I'm pointing that out, I'll get to in a minute or two, but there are two panels between each set of decorations. And the upper and lower border of this text are profusely illustrated. They're really just bursting with illustrations and scenes of the key moment of the Purim story. And it's envisioned through the lens of Italian 18th century theatrical drama. And you can see these scenes that are populated with boisterous protagonists. From the Purim story, there are musicians which we'll encounter playing instruments, flutes, pipes, French horns, bassoons. Everyone is dressed in fancy court dress, 18th century costume. And it all contributes to a sense of general merriment around the whole holiday. I want to look a little closer and bring a deep dive. I'll tell you the scenes going on here. We're going to discuss this scene over here in depth in a minute, but you can see that, we'll discuss it in 1 minute. The women are being brought to the palace, right? The Purim story is about the Achashverosh, this king, holds parties that go on for months, and then another party for the people of Shushan, those parties go on for a bit, and Vashti, his first wife, is commanded to appear, but she doesn't appear. Oh, you know what, we'll go there. We'll just go there. Here we go. Vashti, his first wife, is commanded to appear at the party, and she says no. And the rabbis wonder, like, why would you say no to the king? Like, he's throwing a party, just come. But it says, the scroll of Esther, the book of Esther actually says, he commands her to come wearing her royal crown. So the rabbis say, he asked her to come with her royal crown and no other clothing. So she didn't want to appear nude, like that wasn't for her. So she says no. And he gets very angry, he does, and he sort of sends her away, according to the text. But this kicks off the Purim story because then he goes to look for new women to have as a wife, and Esther is chosen. She's brought to the palace, and he crowns her and makes her his queen and throws yet another party, and then the story unfolds from there. And we'll see more of that in a minute. But it's an interesting question. Like, she refuses, and what I find interesting about this scroll is not only does it have the general tale of the story as it appears in the book of Esther, but it also has what's known as midrashim. Midrashim is the rabbinic overlay. It's the extra textual material that the rabbis brought to the story. They read the book and they said, like, what's actually going on here? Like, why doesn't Vashti come? Because he told her to appear nude, right? That's not in the book. And then the rabbis, who took a very dim view of Vashti, actually went a little further. They say, you know, she wasn't just sent away, she was killed. Okay, that's in the Talmud already, that Vashti was beheaded, she was killed. And in the Talmud, in Masechet Megillah, in Tractate Megillah, they actually go a little bit further, and they say, why was she killed? Because she actually brought Jewish women to the palace, and she made them work on the Sabbath naked. And it's not 100% clear to me. And so this is what's known as measure for measure, mida keneged mida, because she did this terrible thing to the Jewish women. Therefore, she was killed. And you can see here, right? It's right over here. Let me get that here. Here's a woman with her crown on, and she's naked, and she's being escorted away by these soldiers, and she's about to be killed. So again, this is something going on in the text that's not in the biblical story. He was a very knowledgeable scribe artist, and he's inserting this into the illustration. And I find that quite intriguing, because these artists, like Joel ben Simeon, were not just looking at the basic text, they were going further. This is another example. We're further along in the story. Haman has asked to kill the Jewish people. Ahasuerus has granted him permission. And then Esther finds out about this, told by Mordecai, and she figures out a plan to save the Jewish people. She holds a dinner. She invites Ahasuerus and Haman, and Ahasuerus says, "Tell me what's on your mind. Tell me what you want, what you really, really want." And she says, "No, come back to another party the next night, and I'll tell you tomorrow night." And so he goes to sleep, but he can't sleep, Ahasuerus. So they read to him from his book of days, right? You can see that down here. And who should come in but Haman? And Haman, king says, "What you doing here, Haman? I understand that there's this person who saved my life earlier," which Mordecai had done by revealing a plot against Ahasuerus. He says, "What should I do to help this person who saved my life?" And Haman says, "Well, you should take him on a horse, and he should be paraded through the streets of Shushan, and they should say, 'This is how we honor the person. This is what we do to the king, to the person whom the king wants to honor.'" And so Ahasuerus says to Haman, "Right, you go and do that. Take Mordecai, and you parade him through the streets." Now, there's an interesting story over here as well, and I probably should have brought you a close-up. Can you see this part up here where my arrow is? So here you see Mordecai, and he's on horseback, and he's being led by this trumpeter here. And can you see up here there's a woman, and she's pouring some slop out the window. So that's another midrash, that's another rabbinic overlay. What's going on here is that Haman comes home from this episode, and it says that he is chafui rosh. Now, what does chafui rosh mean? It literally means like his head is covered in garbage, but it doesn't quite explain what's going on. So the rabbis say, what happened was that Haman's daughter looked out the window, saw that someone was being led through the streets of Shushan, and she assumed that her father was on horseback, and it was Mordecai leading him. So she threw a bucket of slop on his head. So again, these are like the moments where the rabbis are explaining him, and if you know the midrash, you will recognize that that's what's going on here, and if you don't, you might learn about it through this illustration. So the story goes on. The Jews are allowed to save themselves. They go to war. Haman's 10 sons are hung. You see the sort of musicians are appearing here, these kind of court musicians, sort of celebrating all the redemption that occurs. And now now we have a little bit of information about how we know where and when this scroll was made. Sometimes the rabbinic, let me go back one step. How do we know where Esther's scrolls were created? Many of you may know that Esther's scrolls are kind of modeled. Esther's are a book in scroll format. In order to, the rabbis kind of instituted that in order to fulfill the commandment of reading the book of Esther, it has to be read from scroll format, right? And the other important scroll in Jewish life is the Torah scroll. And Torah scrolls have another whole level of sanctity. You can't add even one extra letter into a Torah scroll. You certainly can't have illustrations. And the rabbis then go about debating, is an Esther scroll have the same sanctity as a Torah scroll, or is it different? Like, what are the rules that apply to Esther scrolls? And they come out with a couple of different opinions. The difference between a Torah scroll and an Esther scroll is that the scroll of Esther, also known as a Megillah in Hebrew, does not have the name of God. Doesn't have the name of God in it. And so some of the rabbis felt it had one level less of sanctity, and therefore you could add extra words. For example, you could have the blessings that are recited before and after the scroll is read on the scroll itself. Or you could have illustrations on the scroll. You can't do any of this with a Torah scroll. And some rabbis agreed that you can have these extra blessings on the scroll of Esther, and some rabbis said, you know what, just to be on the safe side, why don't you put the extra text on a separate sheet known as a blessing sheet? And what you're looking at in front of you is the blessing sheet that comes with this Washington Haggadah. It's a separate sheet. It's not attached. It's usually rolled around it. A lot of times these sheets got lost because they weren't actually attached. We don't have a lot of blessing sheets, but we do have some. And sometimes this is where the scribe will sign and date his work. And for example, there's one very well-known scribe who travels from Poland, and he goes to Germany, goes to Italy, and we can actually follow his entire route. It's Aryeh ben Daniel of Gorey, which is the subject of a different lecture. But we can follow exactly where he's going because he tells us what town he's in, and it's very interesting that way. Here we don't have the name of the scribe, but we have two things that tell us a little bit about where this Megillah was written. Number one, if you look over here, you will see that there is a piyut. It's a liturgical hymn, and this liturgical hymn was written by Abraham ibn Ezra, and it was called Korei Megillah, and it was recited by the Jew in Jewish Italian communities. So that's one clue that this is probably an Esther scroll written for Jews in Italy. There's another really, because it's characteristic of the custom in Italy. The other clue, which I mentioned earlier, and we'll go back one, is this double text column. The double text column, it's a subtle thing, and only because libraries, God bless them, have digitized their collections, are we able to study them en masse. The only time that we see these double panels of text, one right next to the other, not separated, are in scrolls from Italy. So that's like a clue that we can glean from the digitization. And the last clue is really quite wonderful. It's a scene over here below, okay? Those of you who are familiar with printed Haggadot may recognize this scene. It's the walled city of Jerusalem, and you have Elijah heralding the Messiah on donkey over here, okay? And you might ask, why is this scene of a walled Jerusalem which we first find in the 1609 printed Venice Haggadah, what is that doing here? And the answer is as follows. It is a scene of redemption, of course, and Purim is a story of redemption, so that's kind of a basic level. But what you're looking at here is a Esther scroll with a printed border. I don't think you have one in a Grisolini scroll. We can fix that sometime. Okay, but this is an Esther scroll, and it was printed. The border was printed. You have to handwrite Esther scrolls. You can't print them if you want them to be kosher, if you want them to be fit for ritual use. So what scribes did, what printing houses did and then gave to scribes is they printed a border much faster and cheaper. You could create more scrolls that way as a source of revenue, and then a scribe would come and write in the text. And here this is done by Grisolini, who was a fairly famous Christian artist who was working in Italy hand in hand with the Jewish community. He was working in the 1740s, and you can see that at the bottom here, he took this image from the Venice Haggadah of 1609, and of course the Haggadah is a place where we do see the idea, and it actually takes us back to Joel ben Simeon, where you have images of Elijah, the prophet Elijah, heralding the Messiah. And so Grisolini took this motif from the Haggadah and he put it into his printed border. So, and I'm bringing you two examples just because it's a little bit easier. One is this black and white one here, and here you can see another example that's hand-colored. And so this is a printed border that was printed in Venice that had some circulation, but nevertheless, it is likely that whoever was illustrating the Library of Congress Washington Haggadah probably had access to this image, and you can see how the walled image of Jerusalem with Elijah heralding the Messiah is taken directly from that Grisolini scroll. What I think is going on here is another midrashic reference, which is, the story goes that Esther and Ahasuerus had a son, and this son was Darius II. And Darius II was the king who allowed the Jews to rebuild the temple, the second temple. So, you know, I think that's what's going on here. It's like the story of Purim ends, but it's a moment where they look for redemption as well. Okay, now we're going to switch genres a little bit to decorated marriage contracts. And the library has quite a few marriage contracts. They're known as ketubot, or plural, or ketubah in Hebrew, from the root word ketov, like to write, right? You write out a contract. And this is a marriage contract that was created in Ancona, in the Italian city of Ancona, in 1722. And you might wonder why they're decorating legal contracts, but it's a celebratory moment, and there was a custom of decorating ketubot, Jewish marriage contracts, going back all the way to the 12th century. We have examples of decorated ketubot that were found in the Cairo Geniza in Egypt. And then this custom begins again in Spain, and when the Jews leave Spain for what's known as the Sephardic diaspora, let me say that, or when the Jews are expelled from Spain in 1492 and in Portugal in 1497, all of the various centers of Sephardic diaspora, we begin to see decorated ketubot. And this begins in Italy, again in the 16th century. Do we have 15th century ketubot in Italy? No, I think not. I think it's 16th. And it really begins to flourish just like Megillah decorations. And this one here from 1722 is really kind of at the peak of ketubah decoration in Italy. And it celebrates the wedding of Shmuel, Moses, Ben David, HaKohen, and Diamante, she's using her Italian name, the daughter of Moses, HaKohen. So those are the two people who are being celebrated here. And you can see that the text of the ketubah is over here, happened on a Wednesday. It was the 9th of Kislev, the year 5483, which actually turns out to be November 18th, 1722. And this is a very beautiful Ancona border where they incorporate these birds and this floral decoration. It almost looks Dutch, actually, when you think about it, but it is Ancona. This is typical Ancona. And what you see on top here is the family coat of arms. And the Jews in Italy and other places as well, but primarily in Italy, adopted for themselves family emblems. They weren't granted these family emblems officially by the ruling authorities, but they looked around and they saw that the wealthy Christian families all had wonderful coats of arms, and they thought, this is a good idea, we're going to do this too. And they adopted these coats of arms, often based on their names, and they used them for hundreds of years. And it's not surprising that we find here the coat of arms with the two hands of blessings of a Kohen, because both the bride and the groom were from Kohen priestly families. And below the text of the ketubah, you find over here the text of the T'naim. It's a little hard to read on the slide. The T'naim are kind of the engagement contracts, the stipulations. And Ancona was a center of ketubah production. Someone asked me a little bit earlier if all the ketubot came out of Ancona, because the Library of Congress actually has two from Ancona. And the answer is no. There were ketubot being produced in all the Italian cities which had Jewish populations, but Ancona was a particularly strong center, and in fact, ketubah decoration continues there for a long time, even late into the 19th century, when it had a time where it had declined in most other Italian Jewish communities. And I'm bringing you actually ketubah. The people who set up the exhibition read my mind. They actually bought this ketubah. You can see it out there. This is a ketubah from Ancona from 1805. And it celebrates the wedding of Aaron ben Chaim of Corfu and Sarah Rivka bat Mordechai de Ovadia. And again, you can see here the text of the ketubah on the top and the stipulations on the bottom. And the stipulations change from town to town. It depends, each city had its own rules and regulations. Some of them, when they're part of port cities like Livorno, they put in all kinds of stipulations about who's going to give yibum if the husband dies. Yibum is what happens if the husband dies without heirs, and the wife has to receive this from the brother of the husband, and if she doesn't, she can't remarry. And Livorno, where you had people going off to sea, you want to make sure that the wife would receive this, and the brothers have to. So anyhow, it's a condition that the city of Livorno has as part of their Tannaim. Here, there's some interesting imagery. And if you see biblical figures on ketubot, often they're chosen to relate to the name of the bride and the groom. And here you see an image of Sarah, and over here an image of Aaron, as shown as the high priest. And in fact, the name of the groom is Aaron, and the name of the bride is Sarah. And so they're using biblical imagery to enhance the ketubah. But not only are they using biblical imagery, you really have to love these Italians. They're also using mythological imagery, and there are these women fawns. You don't generally get, I actually had to look that up if there's a thing, they're called fauna or faunae. And these are women fawns, right? They've got goats and tails and human bodies on top. And what are they doing? But they're holding up an emblem of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments. Like it's just this wonderful confluence that you almost only find in Italy. You know, that you can have mythological imagery coexisting very happily with biblical imagery. And the image of Moses appears on a number of ketubot from Italy, and it generally, we think that it's a covenant, just as Moses sort of was the intermediary between God and the Jewish people in creating a covenant, so too the ketubah creates a covenant between husband and wife. And this ketubah also has a family emblem on bottom, which is a little hard to see. I should have blown that up, but you could, I think there are two lions standing one next to the other over here. Right? So family emblems is something that you find on a lot of Italian ketubot. They put their family emblems on everything, I should say, on their tombstones, on their silver book bindings that they gave as gifts to the bride and the groom, on the tapestries that they gave to the synagogues, on the silver that was dedicated to the synagogues, and it's a really wonderful way of knowing who owns certain things. If on a ketubah, it's easy to know exactly who the protagonists are because the names of the bride and groom are there. But when you have a coat of arms on an Esther scroll, then you can actually know who owned it, even if the name isn't there. I didn't want to suggest that the Library of Congress is completely focused on Western and European art. I brought two ketubot here to show you. And the one on the left is a particularly interesting story. It is a ketubah from Mashhad, which is in northeastern Iran. It's a city in northeastern Iran. And it's celebrating the wedding of Rachamim ben Yisrael and Malka bat Yechezkel on June 3rd, 1889, 4th of Sivan, 5649. And the community in Mashhad has a unique and complex history, because in 1839, after a violent pogrom, the city's Jews were forced to publicly convert to Islam. And for nearly a century, they lived outwardly as Muslims while secretly maintaining Jewish practices. And despite these restrictions, they often sort of kept key life cycle events and practiced traditional Jewish marriage, and actually created a Jewish traditional ketubot, often in addition to the Islamic ones that they had. And you see one here. And the text is a traditional text of the Jewish marriage contract, but you can see that the art really incorporates Persian stylistic aesthetic, and it reflects the community's heritage and surrounding culture. And and then the ketubah to the right here is a ketubah from Istanbul, from Constantinople, Kushta, and this is from 1841, and it celebrates a wedding that happened in the Galata neighborhood in Istanbul, and you can see it's very typical of Turkish ketubot. in the 19th century. I should say that whereas we had decorated ketubot from Egypt early on, and then in Western Europe from the 16th century and onwards, ketubah decoration does not really arrive in Iraq and Iran and in Constantinople until the late 18th and early 19th century. So by 1841, when the Italians are already done for the most part, it's really taking off in Turkey and in other places. But what you're looking at is floral imagery, decorative arabesques, and this is very typical of the art of Jews living in Islamic lands because, as some of you may have heard beforehand, Jews adapted and adopted the art and the country in which they lived. When they lived in Italy, you've got mythological creatures all over their religious documents. When they are living in lands under Islamic rule, you will rarely find figural art. What you'll find is beautiful calligraphy, floral imagery, filigree, sometimes birds and animals, but you will not find figurative art. So that's very typical of the moment. I wanted to end this lecture, but there's a little bit to go, so it's not 5 minutes, with what's my most favorite manuscript in the Library of Congress. Sometimes people ask me what your most favorite is. It's not always easy to say. This is definitely my most favorite manuscript. Despite the fact that it's very large on the screen, it's actually a small little manuscript. It's about this big, right, Yoram? Maybe it's quite small. And they didn't bring it out to display because it is so small, but you can look at the pictures online, and you can see there are many more pictures than what I'm going to show you. And it's a miniature illuminated Hebrew prayer book of exceptional beauty. It's in Hebrew, the title is Seder Kriyat Shema al Hamitah. It's order of prayers before retiring at night. And the manuscript was created as part of the renaissance of Hebrew manuscript production that began in the Habsburg Empire at the beginning of the 18th century, primarily in Prague and Vienna, and then it spreads out. Vienna is really the epicenter, but it goes to other places as well at the beginning of the 18th century. And the people for whom these books were created were the court Jews. They were the financiers to all of the principalities and the dukes and the dukedoms and the princes in the Habsburg Empire. What's happening? At this time, Hebrew printing is well underway. Jews began printing very quickly after the advent of printing, after Gutenberg begins with his grammar book, and then, of course, his very famous Bible in 1455. Jews, the earliest printed Hebrew book that we know of was done in Rome between the year 1469 and 1472. So within short order, Jews have adopted printing, and they're off and running, and they think it's quite miraculous. So by the 18th century, there are thousands of books being printed in every one shot. So the court Jews, these very wealthy individuals, are looking around. They're in the court. They're actually, part and parcel of the aristocracy. They're sort of separate but equal, but they're certainly living as nicely as all of the aristocrats around them. And they're looking at all these really beautiful bespoke items. And anybody could buy a printed book at that time, so they go one better, and they began to commission, at the very beginning of the 18th century, books as presentations, as gifts. Beautifully illustrated books, illuminated, and almost all of these books, I should say, like 98% of them, are done for personal use. They're small books, they're for domestic use, they are books of prayer, Haggadot to be used at home, Sabbath prayers, books of Psalms. There are a few large books, very few, count them probably on one hand, for use in the synagogue, but that's not the majority. We think there are about 600 or so of these books left from around the world, and this is one of the nicest. So this phenomena lasts for about 70 years and then kind of peters out, probably as the court Jews themselves as an institution are petering out with the advent of baking, etc. So let's take a deep dive into this book. This manuscript was made for a woman. It was gifted to be a woman, and I should say that many of these 18th century manuscripts were gifts from the groom to his bride. And we know that because it actually states it on the title page. But this one in particular was from a husband to his wife. And the text reads, you can follow along with me, Seder Kriyat Shema Al Hamitah. This is the order of the Kriyat Shema, of the Shema and the prayers recited before retiring at night, before bedtime. Recited on the bed is literally what it says. Hamefu'ar b'tziurim na'im. That is Hamefu'ar, that's made splendid with beautiful pictures. Lefi inyan habonim. This is an interesting phrase. It literally means according to the skill of the artisan. He's referencing a phrase in this prayer that's said around Havdalah of Elijah, and it's the story of another lecture, but it's Elijah helps a man build a house, and it said this is a very beautiful house according to the skill of the artisans. And then it goes on to continue, Binyan Beiti Zo Ishti. So it says over here, this is, my wife is the foundation of my house, or Anne Brenner translated this very nicely, the foundation of my house is my spouse. She is a garland and a crown. I have made this for honor and renown. I am her husband, right? Zot l'chvol tiveret, for honor and renown. Ani ba'ala, I am the husband. Joseph Diern, Katz. Okay, Katz is short for Kohen Tzedek. He was a priest, or he was part of the priestly caste, I should say. And we see that because you can see the hands up on top here. Do you see that? That's his family emblem here. He's part of the priestly caste. If you were part of that caste, you would adopt that as your coat of arms. And there's a date down here, which is always really helpful, 1745, Taf Kuf Hey, right, the Hebrew counting, 1745. So we know that, well, it's interesting. It's actually a question. Asiti zot. When you use the phrase, I made this, what you mean is, I made it. I wrote it, I illustrated it, I made it. There's a question, actually, which is about to come up about who actually made this book. But let's dive a little bit deeper into it before we get to that question. That's the title page. And you see here some of the wonderful prayers. So not only does this book have the prayers of recited at bedtime, but it also has a whole selection of blessings that you recite throughout the year, daily, annually, on occasion. When you light the Sabbath candles, right, over here, you see a woman lighting the Sabbath candles in a really elaborate home, I might add. So there are a bunch of different blessings. This is a blessing over here for when you have a medical treatment. You hope that the medical treatment will be successful. No. This is a wonderful blessing. This is a blessing over wine. I think this is the only example I know of where this very, prophetic figure of Bacchus appears straddling a wine barrel. It's quite something for 18th century Hebrew manuscripts. He looks very joyous, and it is an illustration recited when drinking wine. These are illustrations which I don't think appear in any other manuscripts as well as they are depicted here. One thing I should say about Hebrew manuscripts of the 18th century is they tend to be copies of one another. So you have Haggadot, and the Haggadot that are decorated in the 18th century basically all copy the cycle of illustrations found in the printed Amsterdam Haggadah of 1695. This artist is doing his own thing. This is not copies that you find. The Bacchus is not seen anywhere. These are illustrations for when you see either a Jewish king or a secular king, okay? And the instructions are in Yiddish here. And this is when you see a Jewish ruler, you bless God, shechalak mikvodo liyireyav, that God has granted of his honor to those who fear him. And when you see a ruling monarch who's not Jewish, you see shechalak mikvodo lebasar v'dam, that God has given of his honor to flesh and blood. These court Jews actually saw these emperors and rulers, so it was a relevant a relevant blessing. And here's another blessing. You know, this rarely appears. There's only one other book, which we'll see in a minute, that I've seen it in. This is a blessing when you see a Jewish scholar and when you see a Christian scholar, or a scholar that's not Jewish. I guess Islamic is a possibility, but that's not who they were thinking of when they wrote this. Here is Shenatan mechachmato liyireyav, that God has given of his wisdom, of God's wisdom, to his to those who fear him. And here you have this scholar with all kinds of interesting scholarly equipment, and chalak mechachmato lebasar, that God has granted of his wisdom to flesh and blood. Right? And he's actually wearing a wig over here, so it's quite wonderful. And just to give you one other page, because we're going to come back to it. Remember, the book is tiny. It's a tiny little book, right? So this page is only about this big. You have this wonderful image of David, King David, in this incredible kind of Baroque room, which is completely covered in decoration. You must go online and see this illustration up close. And he's here with his harp, and King David the Psalms are attributed to him. And so he's often shown next to verses from Psalm. Here he's shown next to the page of Adon Olam. He's basically a figure in prayer. And the last image I want to show you from this book, before we stop with comparison, is the blessing over a rainbow, all right? When you see a rainbow, you make a special blessing that God has remembered his covenant, and he is faithful to the covenant, and it is a special blessing that you make on those few moments that you see the rainbow, all right? Blessed are you, O Lord, God of the universe. You remember the covenant, faithful to the covenant, and keeps the promise. The covenant refers to the fact that after Noah came out of the ark, God promised that there would never be another flood. So when one sees a rainbow, we sort of remember that moment, like, please, no floods. And floods can be very destructive, as we all know. In this little book, right, remember how tiny the page is, okay? The page is tiny. And in this book, you see here the words of the blessing, and the name underneath, Yuspe Schmalkein. Schmalkein. Yeah, it's not an easy word to pronounce, right? So tiny, tiny words. And some scholars had attributed this book to him, because we know him as a scribe from other manuscripts. Where does he come up? We see this one Seder Kriyat Shema, okay, that he did for a nice woman called Yenta, that's her name over here, and with the hope that he will not be forgotten. And he signs his name, Yuspe Schmalkein. I actually put it on Google Pronounce, and I'm still losing it. You can all put it on Google Pronounce and see. Look at the writing on this. Okay, this is sloppy. This is not fan. And look at these images. It's the same scholar and rabbi for the same blessings, but they're not really accomplished. Okay, they're just not. And just to show you how unaccomplished they are, right? Look at this text over here and this image of David as he's with his harp, and look at the one in the prayer book in the Library of Congress. Now, this book here on the right, Yuspa, has actually signed his name to, so we know that it's his work. In this book on the left, his name appears in a book underneath a rainbow. I don't know. Is it the same person? Like that would be, it's not clear to me. There's another book that he signs his name to, two other books. And this over here, again, he says it's a blessing over the moon, the new moon. And this is from 1738. It was done in Mainz. And again, he signs his name here, Yuspa. You can see it. And he says that he's writing it in Mainz. There are actually two title pages to this book. I bought both of them. But you can see his handwriting. It's okay. It's not great. So what do we have here? We have 3 books, 2 of which are of vastly different quality than the one in the Library of Congress. And I think it's an open question who actually was the artist and scribe in the manuscript that we see at the Library of Congress. And I think by virtue of the fact that this book has been digitized, it will allow scholars around the world maybe to do a little bit more research and see whose work it is. So I'd like to, let's see here. I'd like to actually close with this one last image from the book, which we, in the Library of Congress, which we don't know who wrote, because in 2 weeks we're going to celebrate the start of the Jewish New Year, and it's a moment when we take time to reflect on the accomplishments of the past and the past year. And it's a custom to make a special blessing, the Shechianu blessing, where you give thanks, and it's recited on special occasions. And I can think of no better way to welcome the new year than to give thanks to the Library of Congress and the Berg Foundation for making these wonderful treasures available to the world. And we are blessed to have been kept alive and sustained and have reached this moment. Thank you very much. This is the Shechianu prayer here. That's what I was, Sure.
You said that the artists were affected by the culture that they were in. I didn't hear, but it's possible you addressed the question. Were there any Jewish restrictions on the kind of figures or art that they could do?
That's a good question, and I often open my lectures about that, and I probably should have. So, you know, one of the, like when I started working in art history, you still had to talk about the fact that, yes, Jews have art. You know, this idea that Jews don't have art is like a 19th century sort of German, not Jewish, you know, idea about the Jews as the word and the sound. And but the rabbis debated what kind of art was allowed. Basically, all two-dimensional art is allowed. So manuscripts, ketubot, megillot, it's all allowed. Three-dimensional art, what they're worried about is the worship. And so they're concerned, three-dimensional art, you might come to worship it as an idol. That they're not so clear about. But two-dimensional art is perfectly permissible. Within two-dimensional art, the rabbi said you can do everything except for the servants of God. So you can't show the sun and the moon and the heavenly chariot of Ezekiel. We have these all over Jewish art, so that was observed more in the breach than anything else. But thank you for pointing that out. I almost always start with that. Books and manuscripts are illustrated, sometimes by Jewish artists, by Joel Ben Simeon, sometimes by Christian artists. The books that we looked at tonight, both the ketubot, the megillot, this 18th century scribe artist, and the medieval, were all done by Jewish artists. But the Jews didn't always have access to learn the skills of art, so there are many medieval and Renaissance Hebrew manuscripts that are actually also written by Jewish scribes, but then illustrated by Christian artists. So it's a mix.
Hi, first of all, thank you for an amazing presentation. I'm wondering, Ashkenazim that are in the West, in like, let's say, 16th, 17th century Europe, did they ever express an imagination for maybe what Jerusalem or the clothing of the prophets would have worn or something? Or are they always, always, always like, you're in a Victorian robe or you're in a castle when you maybe should be creative about what life would have looked like in a very long time ago?
That's a good question. It's actually even an earlier question because there's this image of the temple that looks like the mosque, like the Golden Mosque, and that appears all throughout Hebrew manuscripts. And it seems to have been brought back through the Crusaders as the image of what the temple looked like, and the Jews then adopted that for their work. And I can give you examples of where that, in fact, I think it might have been in that 1609. They tended to make Jerusalem in the image of whatever city they were in. There are some Italian travelers' scrolls and books where they illustrate the graves of the righteous. There's an entire book about that by Rachel in the Israel Museum, whose name I'll think of in 1 minute. No. It's a scholar there whose name I'm blanking on right now. You can cut out the fact that I'm blanking on her from this video. But she did an entire book about sort of these scrolls, and in there they do try to imagine what it would have looked like. But otherwise, they do put themselves into contemporary dress. It's like we're participating in the story. That's really what it's about. It's like bringing yourself in.
I have a playful comment on the birds,
Go.
which is, my first thought was, halach ma'anya is the matzah. Matzah makes crumbs.
Yeah.
Falls to the bottom of the page and the birds eat it.
Good.
And, there are many midrashim featuring birds, so I just wonder if maybe in the mind of the artist, it was an opportunity.
He was very playful. It might well have been.
to pick that up.
Might well have been. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, not a question about birds particularly, but I was very interested in the book and how many images from nature. There's the vines, the flowers, the birds, I've seen them with fruits. Has anyone with a natural history background ever looked at this and said, how representative are these? Are like the crops, the birds, the flowers of the regions where those books both made and for example?
I don't think so, but the other place, if you wanted to pursue this, would be the ketubot that were produced in Amsterdam, beginning in the 1660s. Those look really Dutch, and they've got tulips, and they've got all kinds of things going on. And maybe you know that already. So it's pretty clear that when they're that specific, they are illustrating what's around them. It's a good question.
Is this working? Okay. You mentioned Jewish family seals, and I'm curious if there were kind of standardized rules like there were for coat of arms of like the great European powers at the time.
No, because they weren't official. So, they really adapted. Sometimes there weren't rules, but you could have the Mele family have 3 bees in a bird's hide because it relates to honey. And the Kohanim always had the Kohanim hands, and the Levites had a pitcher pouring water because they would wash the hands of the Kohanim. So some of them play off the family name. There are a lot of motifs that are used again and again and again, which is annoying because then you don't know which family is using them. So lions, palm trees. There's Yoam or somebody else could probably point you to a study that was done that has hundreds of these, and you could kind of see what's going on. But no, there's not that I know of.
This also relates to the family crests. But in particular in the illuminated books, in the Haggadot and so on. I'm always interested in the social history that can be done from finding, from identifying the people who've commissioned the works. Mm-hmm. And lots of work has been done, in London on that, for instance. So I'm fascinated by your identifying the family crests in some of the books. Do we have, so you can already tell who has probably commissioned them? Because no scribe is going to take the months or years to do one of these books without a commission.
Sure.
I can tell you that from experience. And are there any other documents that have turned up about the conditions, the commission conditions and that kind of thing for these works?
Do you mean like contracts to commission a Hebrew manuscript?
Exactly.
There are some, but not a lot. There are some, mostly we glean them from the title pages of Hebrew books, where it says, I wrote this for so-and-so. But they don't generally tell us how much money. What we do have is when they get sold, we find out, like, when the person for whom it was commissioned sells it, or their heirs sell it, then it sometimes says, I bought this for so much and so much florins.
So in the provenance.
Prachim, yeah.
Okay.
So sometimes we can trace the amounts that way, and we can see who's purchased the manuscripts. And the family emblems have an interesting story. There's this one very famous manuscript called the Rothschild Machzer, which has 2 family emblems in it. And Dr. Evelyn Cohen has opined that although it was written, because we see in the back who it was written for, the Gallico family, nevertheless it was for a marriage for the Norse family, and the 2 of them joined together in marriage, and that's why you have 2 coats of arms in one manuscript. So, you know, that you can do that as well.
Since I'm sitting up at the front, I can see in this image you have on the screen here that the 3rd word of each blessing is tzadi, whereas in a modern prayer book that would be...
It's not. It's 2 yuds that look like a tzadi, right? That's Hashem. Baruch atah, it's God's name.
That I would expect 2 yuds, but
It actually is 2 yuds with a little schminkel underneath. That's 2 yuds with that. So scribes had different ways of writing God's name, and this goes back, like if you look at the Spanish Bibles, the yuds get written like triple yuds, and if you go to Ashkenazi medieval, they get written in other ways, and sometimes you can identify who the scribe is, and you know what, whoever works on this manuscript, we should point that out, by the way that they wrote God's name. Yeah. So it's not a tzadi, it's 2 yuds with a, yeah.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much. This is a great presentation. You mentioned Jews sort of like co-opting the art style wherever they were, whether it was in Italy or Iran. I'm curious if you see any of this in Spain at all.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Well, okay, so the Jews are out of Spain by 1492, but if you look at the manuscripts they created beforehand, you have all of these Moorish, well, and some manuscripts you have both. They both adopt these carpet pages, which they were, although they were living under Christian rule at the time that many of these manuscripts were made in the 14th century, they're adopting the Islamic vocabulary. And there's books been written about that, which I could point you to. There's one particular manuscript that's now on view at the cloisters where it's got both the Islamic imagery, the decorative imagery, and these Christian tables and grotesques, and it's got both things going on. So yes, they definitely, it's absolutely in Spain and Portugal as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon.
Should I let this? One more question? Or?
Hi. So you mentioned earlier when you were speaking about one of the pages that the name Allah was used, and I was wondering, was Allah like typically used in order to kind of hide their faith, and also like, or maybe I misheard?
Excuse me? Rachamim, I think. I don't think it was Allah. I don't think I mentioned, if I mentioned Allah, then it was not.
Oh, okay,
No.
Okay. Sorry, I must have missed it.
I can go back and tell you, but there's no Allah in any of these.
Okay. So as far as the pages that the marriage contracts, were those often hidden when they were living under Islamic rule, or?
Yeah, so nowadays it's the custom, like you pay a lot of money and you get a decorated marriage contract and you hang it up. What's really interesting is these were not viewed as art objects. When they had a marriage contract and they were decorated in Italy, we know that they were rolled up and tied, we still have some of those tied left, and put in some secure place because you might actually need it, because what the marriage contract did was it gave the woman rights and money in case of death or divorce. So it was to protect the wife. I should have said that, I'm sorry. So they were kept securely somewhere. They were not created. It was like they literally had a one-night stand. You brought them out, you read them at the wedding, and then you put them away, and that was it. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That they came from Morocco. The beautiful lights on the wall, but it's mentioned that it's not real.
Oh, really?
But the real Kuwaites are the wife's parents.
Yes, that sometimes you gave it to the wife's parents, and I think in North African countries also they folded them up and there were special textile envelopes that they put them in. You often find, yes, okay, so.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you so much for sharing.